The morning broke grey and uncertain, with clouds pressing down upon St. Mary Mead like a heavy hand. Miss Marple had slept poorly, her dreams populated by half-remembered faces and conversations that seemed to shift and reform just beyond conscious grasp. She woke at her usual hour, 6 o'clock, and set about her morning routine with the mechanical precision of someone who had performed the same actions for 60 years: the kettle, the tea, the careful arrangement of her breakfast things on the small table by the window. It was while she was thus engaged, her mind pleasantly unoccupied with the familiar tasks, that she heard the commotion in the street outside. The sound of running footsteps, rapid and panicked, followed by raised voices. Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care and moved to the window. Young Timothy Marsh, the bookshop proprietor, was running toward the village center, his hair disheveled and his face flushed with exertion or distress. Behind him came Mrs. Burgess, clutching her cardigan about herself despite the mild morning temperature. Both seemed to be heading toward Thornfield House. Miss Marple finished her tea methodically. There was no point in abandoning it simply because something unusual was occurring, but she wasted no time after that. She collected her walking stick and her handbag, as was proper, and proceeded down the high street at a pace that, while appearing leisurely to the casual observer, conveyed her with considerable efficiency toward Thornfield House. The front gate stood open, which was unusual. Margaret Ashford was a woman who believed in maintaining certain standards, and open gates suggested either carelessness or emergency. Miss Marple suspected it was the latter. A small crowd had already begun to gather near the house. Dr. Havers was there, having been fetched from his morning surgery. The vicar stood with his wife, both of them looking rather shell-shocked. Police Constable Bridges, who handled most of St. Mary Mead's minor infractions and the occasional traffic dispute, was speaking urgently into his telephone near the front door. "What has happened?" Miss Marple asked Eleanor Hartwell, who stood at the periphery of the growing cluster of villagers, her face pale with that particular expression of shock that suggested she had already heard the essential facts, but could not quite believe them to be true. "It's David," Eleanor said quietly. "David Ashford. They've found him. In the morning room. He's—" "Miss Marple, I'm afraid he's dead." The words seemed to hang in the grey morning air like a sentence spoken in a foreign language, intelligible in their individual components, but somehow incomprehensible as a whole. Miss Marple felt her mind, that reliable instrument which had served her so well for so many years, perform a strange sort of double-take, as though refusing initially to process what she had been told. "How dreadful," she said, and her voice sounded quite normal to her own ears, though from a vast distance away. "When did this occur?" "This morning," Eleanor replied. "The maid. Margaret has only the one, you know. That girl from the village. She came in to light the fire in the morning room and found him there. He was in the armchair," Eleanor said, "just sitting there. At first she thought he was asleep, but then she saw—" Eleanor's voice wavered and she did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. "Where is Margaret?" Miss Marple asked. "Inside with the doctor. She's very distressed, naturally. They're trying to keep her calm until the inspector arrives from the county police. It's being treated as suspicious, you see. There's no apparent reason why a man of his age should simply—" "Simply what?" Miss Marple inquired gently. "Simply die," Eleanor finished, rather helplessly. Constable Bridges, having completed his telephone conversation, caught sight of Miss Marple and made his way toward her with the slightly anxious expression of a man who, while comfortable with traffic disputes and lost bicycles, found himself out of his depth in matters of genuine consequence. "Miss Marple," he said, nodding respectfully. "A dreadful business, isn't it? I don't suppose you happened to notice anything unusual yesterday, at the garden party, I mean." This was an interesting question, Miss Marple reflected. Constable Bridges was hardly the sort to conduct a genuine investigation, and yet he was already, with the intuition of someone trained in the mechanics of inquiry, beginning to ask the questions that such matters demanded. "The garden party was pleasant," Miss Marple said, "though there was an unexpected visitor. A gentleman named William Crestwell, I believe. He arrived mid-afternoon and stayed only briefly." Constable Bridges made a note in his small book. "Do you know this Mr. Crestwell?" "I do not," Miss Marple replied, "but Mr. David Ashford appeared to know him. They were at school together, I understand. From London, I think, though I couldn't say for certain." "Right," the constable said, though he didn't look particularly enlightened by this information. "Well, the inspector will want to talk to everyone, I expect. We're to keep the house cordoned off until he's had a look at things. Seems there might have been something that wasn't quite natural about it all." Miss Marple understood perfectly what was being implied without being directly stated. Young men of 34 did not typically die in armchairs in their aunt's morning rooms without cause, and the very fact that this death was being treated as suspicious suggested that there was something about David Ashford's appearance or the circumstances of his demise that had prompted such a conclusion. "Has anyone informed Mr. Crestwell?" Miss Marple asked. "It seems he would be among the last people to have seen Mr. Ashford alive." Constable Bridges looked momentarily embarrassed at this obvious oversight. "We don't have an Arbor Bureau address for him, do we? He just turned up yesterday." "That seems like an important detail to establish," Miss Marple said mildly. "I imagine he may be staying at the hotel in the town or one of the larger establishments nearby." Constable Bridges made another note, looking grateful for this practical suggestion. Behind him, the morning room window remained dark and curtained, and the grey morning pressed down upon St. Mary Mead like a judgment. By late morning, the county inspector had arrived, a man named Rutherford who possessed the kind of weathered competence that suggested he had investigated far worse crimes than the death of a single man in a village morning room. He was in his early 60s with iron-grey hair and eyes that missed very little. He established himself in Margaret Ashford's study and began the systematic process of collecting statements from those who had been present at the garden party. Miss Marple was asked to wait in the drawing-room, along with several other guests who had remained to assist with inquiries. She sat quietly with her knitting, undisturbed by the commotion around her, observing the other occupants of the room with a kind of peripheral attention that made most people forget she was there at all. Dr. Havers sat stiffly on one of the Chesterfield sofas, his jaw working as though he were grinding his teeth. Patricia Stone, the postmistress's daughter, perched on the edge of an armchair, her hands twisting together in her lap, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. The vicar and his wife occupied another sofa, speaking in hushed tones. Eleanor Hartwell stood by the window, staring out at the grey morning with an expression of profound distaste, as though the weather itself was somehow responsible for this disruption of the village's peace. "It was poison," Patricia Stone said suddenly, her voice thin and high with hysteria. "I'm certain it was poison. He looked so dreadful," they said, "so discoloured. That's what poison does, doesn't it? That's what Mrs. Everett told me when she was reading that mystery novel last month." "Patricia, you're being absurd," Dr. Havers said sharply, more curtly than was perhaps kind. "The man is dead. We don't yet know the cause. There's no point in speculating wildly." "But you looked at him," Patricia pressed. "You examined him this morning. You must know something." The doctor's face darkened. "I examined him superficially. Pending a proper autopsy, conducted by qualified pathologists, there is no way to determine the cause of death. And I would appreciate it if you didn't go about the village spreading theories based on detective novels." Patricia fell silent, but her hands continued their anxious twisting, and Miss Marple noted that her eyes kept straying toward the door as though she were calculating the possibility of escape. It was shortly after noon when Constable Bridges appeared with news. William Crestwell had been located. He was indeed staying at the Red Lion Hotel, some 5 miles from the village, and Inspector Rutherford had telephoned him to request his immediate presence. Crestwell, apparently, had been cooperative and agreed to come at once. "Curious that he chose to stay so far away," the vicar's wife remarked to her husband. One would think if he was visiting an old school friend, he might have stayed here at the house. Margaret has plenty of room." "Perhaps he was being considerate," the vicar replied, though he sounded uncertain. Eleanor Hartwell turned from the window. "Or perhaps he had other reasons for wanting to maintain some distance. Depends on the nature of their acquaintance, doesn't it?" Miss Marple glanced up from her knitting, her needles pausing for just a fraction of a second. This was an interesting observation, and it suggested that Eleanor Hartwell, despite her outward appearance of refined composure, was possessed of a rather shrewd mind. She had put her finger on the essential oddity of the situation, that William Crestwell's visit had seemed hurried, almost furtive, and that his choice of accommodation at a distance from Thornfield House was indeed a curious one if his connection to David Ashford was merely that of an old school friendship. It was nearly 1 o'clock when William Crestwell arrived. Miss Marple observed his entrance from her seat by the drawing-room window, and she watched with particular interest as he was conducted past the door by Constable Bridges. He looked, if anything, more composed than he had during his brief appearance at the garden party. His dark suit was immaculate, his tie perfectly knotted, his face arranged in an expression of professional sympathy. Inspector Rutherford's voice could be heard from the study, greeting him with the formal courtesy that such interviews demanded. Within moments, Constable Bridges returned to collect the drawing-room occupants one by one for their statements. When Miss Marple's turn came, some 40 minutes later, she found the inspector sitting behind Margaret's desk, his notebook open before him, his pen poised with the expectancy of someone accustomed to extracting relevant information from even the most apparently innocent witnesses. "Miss Marple," he began, consulting his notes. "You were present throughout the garden party yesterday." "I was," she confirmed. "I arrived at approximately 2 o'clock and remained until the event concluded around 5 o'clock. "And you observed Mr. David Ashford?" "I did. He seemed somewhat preoccupied for the first part of the afternoon, though this improved after his acquaintance, Mr. Crestwell, arrived." "Did you observe any interaction between them that struck you as unusual?" Miss Marple considered this carefully. They appeared pleased to see one another initially, though by the time Mr. Crestwell departed, Mr. Ashford seemed somewhat subdued. It would have been difficult to characterize the conversation as entirely cordial, though neither man was overtly hostile. Inspector Rutherford made a note. "And after Mr. Crestwell's departure, what was Mr. Ashford's demeanor?" "Somewhat withdrawn," Miss Marple said. "He took little part in the latter part of the gathering and eventually excused himself to the house, I believe around 4:30. This information seemed to interest the inspector considerably. He made several notes and looked up from his pad with renewed attention. "You have a sharp eye for detail, Miss Marple," he observed. "Tell me, in your judgment, did Mr. Ashford seem in good health? Did he appear to be suffering from any discomfort or distress?" "He appeared in good health," Miss Marple replied, though his state of mind seemed troubled. But then, the arrival of an unexpected visitor can sometimes have that effect on people, particularly if the relationship is not entirely harmonious. "Quite," the inspector said thoughtfully, and Miss Marple, watching his face, understood that he was already beginning to construct the same hypothesis that had been forming in her own mind since Patricia Stone had mentioned poison. The autopsy results arrived 3 days later, brought to Inspector Rutherford by messenger from the county coroner's office. Miss Marple learned of the findings not through any official disclosure, but through the reliable mechanism by which village information circulated. Eleanor Hartwell encountered the vicar's wife at the butcher's shop, who had overheard Constable Bridges speaking to the chemist about the toxicology report. Strychnine. The poison had been strychnine, administered in a quantity sufficient to cause death within hours of ingestion. The preliminary investigation suggested it had been introduced into something David Ashford had consumed during or shortly after the garden party, most likely in the form of a beverage or food item that could mask its bitter taste. By Thursday morning, the entire village was consumed with speculation. The post office buzzed with theories and counter-theories. Mrs. Everett, who had considerable experience with mystery novels, insisted that the poison must have been in the lemonade. The vicar's wife suggested the sandwiches. Dr. Havers, when questioned directly, maintained a professional silence but admitted that strychnine was not a particularly difficult substance to obtain for someone with chemical knowledge. Miss Marple said very little publicly, though she was observing a great deal. She noted the way Patricia Stone had taken to wearing a small gold locket that she kept touching nervously, as though for reassurance. She observed that Eleanor Hartwell had taken to visiting Thornfield House with suspicious frequency, ostensibly to keep Margaret company, but actually, Miss Marple suspected, to glean information for distribution throughout the village. She paid particular attention to the way that William Crestwell, who had remained in St. Mary Mead despite the shocking nature of the death, conducted himself during his limited interactions with the police. It was on Thursday afternoon that Miss Marple made her way to Thornfield House uninvited. This was not entirely unusual. The village had a custom of calling on those in distress. But the timing of her visit, coming as it did after the poisoning had been confirmed, suggested a purpose beyond mere social convention. Margaret received her in the sitting room, looking considerably diminished by the events of the past 72 hours. She had aged, Miss Marple thought, not merely in apparent years, but in some more fundamental sense. The confident woman who had orchestrated a successful garden party seemed to have receded, replaced by someone simultaneously more fragile and more guarded. "How are you managing?" Miss Marple asked, settling herself into the offered chair with a kind of deliberate slowness that suggested she intended to stay for some considerable time. "As well as one might," Margaret replied, which was no answer at all. "It's dreadful, Miss Marple, quite dreadful. David had his faults certainly, but to die in such a manner, in my home at an event I had organized. The police seemed to think that I should have known something was amiss. As though I could have prevented—" She broke off, her hand rising to her throat in a gesture that suggested she was having difficulty breathing. "The police," Miss Marple said gently, "are trained to ask difficult questions. It doesn't necessarily mean they believe you at fault. Tell me, Margaret, had David been troubled about anything in particular during the weeks before his death?" Margaret's eyes shifted away from Miss Marple's own, which was interesting. "He seemed restless, as I mentioned before. But that was nothing unusual for David. He had always been that way since he was a boy. And when Mr. Crestwell arrived, did that seem to agitate him further?" "They had business to discuss," Margaret said carefully. "Some investment matter, I believe. David mentioned something of the sort." Miss Marple allowed a measured silence to develop. She had found that silence often prompted people to fill the space with additional information they had not strictly intended to divulge. Margaret, after a moment, proved susceptible to this tendency. "William seemed rather insistent about some arrangement," Margaret continued, her voice lower now, more confidential. "David kept saying that he couldn't, that the situation had changed, that it was impossible. William seemed quite angry about it, though he maintained a veneer of civility. I excused myself from their conversation, naturally, but one couldn't help overhearing certain phrases." "What sort of arrangement?" Miss Marple inquired. "I honestly don't know," Margaret said, and Miss Marple believed her. "But afterward, when William left, David was in a foul temper. He went directly to his room and didn't come down until dinner time, and even then he barely ate anything." This was useful information, though it raised more questions than it answered. Miss Marple filed it away in the orderly mental repository, where she stored such details, waiting to see how they might eventually coalesce into meaning. "Has Mr. Crestwell remained in the village?" Miss Marple asked. "He's still at the Red Lion," Margaret confirmed, "though I believe Inspector Rutherford has cautioned him not to leave the area pending the completion of the investigation. He seems quite unconcerned about the whole business, from what I can gather. Perfectly composed." Which was, Miss Marple reflected, either the mark of an innocent man secure in his own integrity or the mark of someone who had carefully calculated every element of his involvement in the crime and saw no reason to betray anxiety through visible emotion. As Miss Marple prepared to take her leave some 20 minutes later, she found herself wondering precisely which category William Crestwell fell into. The answer, she suspected, would prove to be considerably more complex than simple innocence or guilt. Inspector Rutherford's investigation had, by Friday morning, begun to focus with considerable intensity on the question of where and how the strychnine had been administered. A methodical search of David Ashford's room had yielded nothing suspicious. No bottles of poison, no notes indicating suicidal ideation, no obvious evidence of self-harm. The garden party refreshments, what remained of them, had been tested and found to contain no trace of the toxin. This left the inspector with a frustrating puzzle. The poison had been ingested, the victim was dead, but the method of delivery remained frustratingly obscure. It was this very obscurity that prompted Inspector Rutherford to conduct a more thorough examination of Thornfield House itself. He requested permission to search not merely David's room but the entire premises, paying particular attention to the morning room where the body had been discovered, the dining room where David had taken his evening meal, and Margaret's private study. Miss Marple learned of this development through the simple expedient of being present in the village post office when Mrs. Stone, Patricia's mother, received a telephone call from Margaret requesting fresh supplies of household items. The post mistress, a woman of limited discretion but considerable energy in the dissemination of information, immediately began speculating aloud about what the police might be seeking. "They're looking for the poison itself, of course," Mrs. Stone pronounced with the confidence of someone who had read every mystery novel published in the past decade. "They think perhaps David didn't ingest it at all, but that he was exposed to it somehow through the air or through contact with contaminated objects." This was, Miss Marple reflected, a rather sophisticated understanding of toxicology for someone whose primary experience with such matters came from fiction. She filed away this information as well, along with the observation that Patricia, who stood behind the counter sorting parcels, had gone quite pale at her mother's pronouncement. It was Friday afternoon when the discovery occurred that shifted the entire tenor of the investigation. Inspector Rutherford himself appeared at Miss Marple's cottage door, his expression suggesting that he had uncovered something of considerable significance. "Miss Marple," he said without preamble, "I wonder if you might spare me a few moments of your time. There's a matter on which I should appreciate your perspective." They settled in her small parlor with tea, and the inspector withdrew from his pocket a small, ornate tin box painted in fading blues and greens, depicting scenes of Chinese landscapes. "This was found," the inspector explained, "in the desk drawer of Mr. David Ashford's room. It was empty, which is to say, whatever it originally contained has been removed. However, forensic analysis of the interior surfaces indicates residual traces of strychnine. The box, we believe, was the container in which the poison was kept." Miss Marple examined the box with genuine interest. It was quite lovely in its way, the sort of thing one might acquire in London or at a seaside resort. The kind of decorative object that people often used for storing small valuables or sentimental items. "It's empty now," Miss Marple observed, "which suggests that whoever placed it there intended for it to be found eventually, or perhaps hoped it might be discovered and misinterpreted as evidence of Mr. Ashford's suicidal intention." "That was my thought precisely," Inspector Rutherford said with evident satisfaction, "though I confess I'm uncertain how to interpret its significance. If Ashford had poisoned himself, he would presumably have concealed the evidence more thoroughly. The fact that the box was left in his desk, almost as though awaiting discovery, suggests either carelessness or deliberate placement." "Has anyone else in the house been questioned about the box?" Miss Marple asked. "Mrs. Ashford claims she has never seen it before," the inspector replied. "The maid, a girl named Susan Hartley, similarly denies knowledge of it. Mr. Crestwell, when shown the box, claimed not to recognize it, though I thought I detected a momentary flicker of something, recognition perhaps, or surprise, when he first saw it. This was extremely interesting. Miss Marple set down her teacup and folded her hands in her lap, a gesture that the inspector had already learned indicated she was engaged in serious thought. "The box is decorative, but not particularly distinctive," Miss Marple observed. "One might purchase such things at any number of establishments. However, the fact that it was found in Mr. Rashford's possession is significant only if one accepts that he placed it there himself. If, on the other hand, someone else placed it there, the implications are quite different." "Precisely my reasoning," the inspector agreed. "Which brings me to the question I came to ask you. In your observations of the garden party, did you notice anything that might suggest which of the guests possessed both the knowledge and the opportunity to introduce poison into the house?" Miss Marple considered this carefully. "Dr. Havers would certainly possess the knowledge," she said slowly. "He has access to various chemicals and compounds through his medical practice. However, knowledge and access do not necessarily indicate motive or opportunity. Mr. Crestwell, from what little I know of him, appears to be a man of means and education. Such men often possess interests in matters both scientific and criminal in nature, if only in the abstract sense. But motive, Inspector, that is what you must establish. Without motive, neither knowledge nor opportunity signifies very much. And that," the inspector said ruefully, "is precisely where my investigation has become most frustrated. The motive remains stubbornly obscure. Unless Mr. Crestwell and Mr. Ashford had some serious falling out that nobody knows about, I cannot establish why he would wish his old school friend dead." "Perhaps," Miss Marple suggested gently, "the motive was not Mr. Crestwell's at all. Perhaps you are assuming the wrong perpetrator because the wrong person had the most obvious opportunity." The inspector looked at her with sudden sharpness. "What do you mean?" "Only," Miss Marple replied, "that in my experience, the most obvious suspect is often the convenient red herring, placed there deliberately by someone with a far more intimate knowledge of the victim and his circumstances." The inspector departed Miss Marple's cottage with considerably more to think about than he had arrived with, and the elderly woman found herself once again alone with her knitting and her thoughts. But her mind, despite the mechanical comfort of the familiar needlework, was engaged in a process of systematic reconstruction, assembling the various fragments of observation and inference into a coherent whole. By Saturday morning, she had reached certain conclusions that prompted her to take action of a rather deliberate kind. She dressed with particular care, arranged her hair with more attention than usual, and set out toward the Red Lion Hotel with the ostensible purpose of conducting a consultation regarding the acquisition of Christmas decorations from London. This was, in fact, entirely false. Miss Marple had no need of Christmas decorations in December when she had already procured them weeks prior, but it provided her with adequate cover for an appearance of casual village business. William Crestwell was found in the hotel's small lounge, reading a newspaper with the kind of focused intensity that suggested he was using it as a barrier against the tedium of enforced idleness. He looked up when Miss Marple entered, and his expression underwent a subtle transformation. Recognition, certainly, but also something more complex, something that might have been calculation masked by courtesy. "Miss Marple," he said, rising to greet her, "what an unexpected pleasure. I trust the village drama has not entirely disrupted the normal rhythms of life." "Quite the opposite," Miss Marple replied, settling into the offered chair with the deliberate slowness of age. "In my experience, dramatic events often reveal far more about the quotidian reality of a place than months of ordinary observation. People become less guarded when they are disturbed." Crestwell smiled, but it was a careful smile, one that revealed nothing of genuine amusement. "A perceptive observation. And what, if I may ask, brings you to seek me out? I assume this is not entirely a social call?" "You are quite right," Miss Marple admitted. "I've been troubled by certain aspects of this dreadful business. As someone who has known St. Mary Mead for a very long time, I've developed certain instincts regarding the people within it. And those instincts suggest that something about the current investigation is fundamentally askew. How intriguing, Crestwell said. And what precisely does your instinct suggest? That you are not, in fact, the murderer, Miss Marple said with striking directness. Which means, of course, that someone else is, and more troublingly, that someone else may be using you as camouflage for their own actions. Crestwell's face remained composed, but his hands, which lay on the arm of his chair, tightened almost imperceptibly. That is quite an accusation to make, Miss Marple. Might I inquire as to what evidence you possess for this rather startling assertion? Evidence is a curious word, Miss Marple mused. It suggests something concrete, something measurable. But human behavior, Mr. Crestwell, is rarely reducible to such tangible things. However, I have observed that you arrived in this village with very specific intent. Not the intent of a man visiting an old friend, but rather the intent of a man conducting business of a transactional nature. Business, I suspect, that did not conclude successfully. Crestwell stood and walked to the window, his back to Miss Marple. When he spoke, his voice was different, stripped of some of its careful civility. David and I had an arrangement, he said quietly. A financial arrangement of some complexity. He had invested money with me several years ago, and certain circumstances had arisen that necessitated my recovery of that investment. He had agreed to repay me, but when I arrived on Thursday, he informed me that he could not, that the money was unavailable. And this angered you? Miss Marple asked. It did, Crestwell acknowledged, but not sufficiently to murder him. My anger was the anger of a businessman facing financial inconvenience, not the rage of a man moved to homicide. Besides which, Miss Marple, I did not know which of the refreshments at that garden party contained poison. I did not have access to David's room. I had no opportunity to introduce a tin box into his desk drawer. From a practical standpoint, I am an execrable suspect. Which is precisely why you are useful, Miss Marple said. Your presence, your documented anger at David, your obvious motive, these things serve as perfect distraction for someone far more intimately positioned to commit the crime. Crestwell turned from the window and looked at her directly. You know who did this? It was not a question, and Miss Marple found herself regarding him with something approaching respect. He was not stupid, whatever his other failings might be. I've formed certain hypotheses, she said, but hypothesis is not knowledge. However, I believe your cooperation might be instrumental in confirming those hypotheses. You see, Mr. Crestwell, you have already provided Inspector Rutherford with more useful information than you perhaps realize. Your testimony regarding David's financial difficulties, his inability to repay you, these things paint a picture of a man under considerable stress. The question becomes, to whom else was he indebted? Who else might have possessed motive sufficient for murder? Crestwell resumed his seat, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a note of resignation. You're asking me to betray confidences. I'm asking you to assist in the apprehension of a murderer, Miss Marple corrected gently. There is a moral distinction between the two. I think you will agree. By the time Miss Marple left the Red Lion Hotel, she possessed information of considerable importance, information that, while not definitively proving anything, created a framework within which certain pieces of the puzzle began to assume coherent shape. William Crestwell had been surprisingly forthcoming once his initial defensiveness had been overcome, and what he had revealed painted a portrait of David Ashford that was considerably more complex than the one the village had constructed. David's financial difficulties were not merely the result of bad investments, they were, rather, the consequence of a more fundamental moral and ethical collapse. Over the past 18 months, he had become involved in what Crestwell delicately termed various schemes of questionable legality. These schemes had required him to borrow money from multiple sources, and his inability to repay these loans had created a cascading series of debts from which he saw no prospect of escape. One particular debt, however, seemed to have troubled him more than the others. Crestwell was uncertain of the specifics, but David had mentioned in passing that he had gotten in deep with someone local. Someone who had been remarkably patient until recently, but whose patience had begun to wear thin. This person, apparently, had issued what amounted to an ultimatum. Repay the debt by a specific date, or face consequences of an unspecified but clearly ominous nature. Miss Marple walked through the village with this information settling into the organized repository of her mind like sediment in water. The question now became not merely who had poisoned David Ashford, but rather which of the village's residents possessed both the knowledge of strychnine and the motive to employ it. It was Eleanor Hartwell whom she sought out next, encountering her at the village library, where Eleanor was engaged in her volunteer work cataloguing books for the rotating collection. Eleanor looked up from her work with the kind of wariness that suggested she had begun to understand that Miss Marple's visits were not merely social calls. "I've been meaning to speak with you," Eleanor said, setting down her pen. "About the investigation. I've remembered something that might be pertinent, though I'm not entirely certain it's significant." "Do tell," Miss Marple encouraged, settling into the offered chair with the patient demeanor of someone prepared to listen indefinitely. "It concerns Patricia Stone," Eleanor began. "A few weeks ago, I happened to encounter her quite by chance near the chemist's shop. She was carrying a parcel, and it fell, quite accidentally, you understand, and broke. The contents spilled across the pavement. I helped her gather them up, and I couldn't help but notice that the parcel had contained various chemical compounds and substances. Nothing particularly unusual in itself, but the quantity was rather remarkable for a young woman with no obvious professional interest in such matters. This was extremely useful information, and Miss Marple's mind immediately began to reconstruct certain observations she had made regarding Patricia Stone. The nervousness, the constant anxiety, the way her eyes had avoided direct contact during the garden party, the locket she had been touching with such frequency, as though for reassurance or perhaps for concealment. "Did you happen to inquire what she intended to do with these substances?" Miss Marple asked. "I did mention it to her," Eleanor admitted. "She became quite flustered and said something about assisting her mother with cleaning supplies and various household remedies. But she was lying, Miss Marple. I've taught schoolgirls for 4 decades, and I can recognize deception in a young woman's face as easily as I can identify a misspelled word." "Indeed," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "And what, in your judgment, might have motivated her to acquire such substances?" Eleanor hesitated, clearly wrestling with some internal conflict between discretion and the demands of accuracy. "I don't like to gossip," she began, which was precisely what everyone said before they proceeded to do exactly that. "But I've heard certain rumors. Nothing concrete, you understand, but suggestions that David Ashford had been paying particular attention to Patricia, that there had been some sort of understanding between them." This revelation cast an entirely new light on the situation. Miss Marple rose from her chair and moved to the library window, her gaze distant and unfocused in a manner that Eleanor had learned to recognize as indicating profound concentration. "An understanding," Miss Marple repeated softly. "How very curious. And when did this understanding apparently commence?" "Within the last month or so," Eleanor replied. "He had begun taking her to various places, the cinema in town, walks through the woods. Her mother was rather encouraging of the attachment, I believe. He was, after all, a man of means with access to certain social circles. For a girl like Patricia, such attentions must have seemed remarkably flattering." "And then something changed," Miss Marple said, still gazing out the window. "Something caused that understanding to alter. Perhaps Mr. Ashford's financial difficulties became known to her, or perhaps he made it clear that the attachment was not as serious as she had believed it to be." Eleanor nodded slowly, understanding beginning to dawn across her features. "You think she poisoned him?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that Patricia Stone possessed both the knowledge, acquired through her chemical purchases, and a potential motive. Whether she possessed the resolve to act upon these things is a different matter entirely. Young women, particularly those of sensitive temperament, often surprise us with the capacity for self-destruction that can masquerade as revenge. But the tin box, Eleanor protested. It was found in David's room. How could Patricia have placed it there without being observed? That, Miss Marple admitted, is the question that requires further investigation. But consider this. Patricia was at the garden party. She had access to the house both before and after the event, and if David had made it clear that he intended to end their understanding, she might have acted with considerable desperation and poor judgment. Miss Marple collected herself and turned back to Eleanor with a calm expression that belied the turbulent activity occurring behind her eyes. "I believe it would be advisable for me to have a conversation with Inspector Rutherford. There are certain theories I should like to present to him, but first, I should very much like to know whether you noticed anything unusual in Patricia's behavior during the garden party itself." Dissents from the garden. "Then how?" Inspector Rutherford demanded. "Did it get into David Ashford's room?" Patricia had no answer to this question, and her repeated assertions of ignorance only deepened the inspector's conviction that she was, at best, a partial witness to the crime, rather than its sole perpetrator. Miss Marple sat in her cottage on Saturday evening, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm, though her attention was directed not at the emerging pattern of wool, but rather at the complex pattern of human motivation that the case had begun to reveal. Patricia Stone had poisoned David Ashford. Of this there was now reasonable certainty. Yet Patricia Stone had not acted alone. Or if she had, then someone else had taken steps to ensure that her crime would be discovered and that additional complications would obscure the nature of her guilt. The tin box troubled her most of all. It was, in essence, a stage prop, a piece of theatrical evidence deliberately placed to create a false narrative. Someone with knowledge of the crime had taken that box and secreted it in David's desk with the precise intention of making the investigators believe that Ashford had either poisoned himself or had kept poison in his possession for purposes unknown. Who possessed both the knowledge and the opportunity to perform such an action? Miss Marple set down her knitting and retrieved from her small writing desk a piece of notepaper upon which she had, over the past several days, inscribed the names of all those who had been present at the garden party. She examined this list with the intensity of a scholar studying an ancient text, looking for patterns and connections that might have escaped more superficial observation. Margaret Ashford, grieving but also inheriting. Eleanor Hartwell, observant, knowledgeable about Patricia's behavior, present at the critical moments. Dr. Havers, possessing knowledge of toxins and their effects. William Crestwell, angry about money but also genuinely concerned about his own legal liability. The vicar and his wife, peripheral but present. Timothy Marsh, observant, literary, perhaps more insightful than his bookshop demeanor suggested. And then there was the person she had not yet seriously considered. Margaret's maid, Susan Hartley, a girl of perhaps 22 who had discovered the body and had been at Thornfield House continuously, both before and after the garden party. Susan, whom everyone had dismissed as too simple to be capable of such complexity. Susan, who had access to every room in the house and whom no one watched particularly carefully because she was, in essence, invisible, the sort of person whose presence people barely registered. But no, there was something else, some detail that her mind kept circling back to, some observation she had made that had not yet found its proper place in the emerging pattern. She thought back to the garden party itself, to the moment when William Crestwell had arrived, to David's reaction, to the subsequent conversation between the two men near the stone wall. And then she remembered. Patricia Stone had been speaking with David when Crestwell arrived. She had watched them from her seat beneath the oak tree, the girl's anxious energy, the man's distracted response. And then, when Crestwell departed, she had noticed Patricia's eyes following him with an expression that might have been fear, or might have been something more complex. What if Patricia had not acted alone? What if someone else had known about her plan? What if that someone else had seen in her emotional vulnerability and her capacity for desperate action an opportunity to accomplish their own objectives? Miss Marple rose abruptly, her decision made. She collected her coat and her walking stick and made her way through the darkening evening toward Margaret Ashford's house. The lights were on in the drawing room, and when Margaret answered the door, she appeared surprised but not unwelcoming. "Miss Marple, what a time to call. Is something wrong?" "I wonder if I might speak with your maid," Miss Marple said without preamble. "Susan Hartley, I believe." Margaret's expression registered confusion. "Susan? Whatever for?" "A small matter of household arrangements that has been troubling me," Miss Marple replied, which was sufficiently vague to be unarguable. "Nothing of great consequence, I'm sure." Susan was summoned from the kitchen, and she appeared with the kind of nervous deference that characterized all of her interactions with her employers. She was a thin girl, with mousy hair and the sort of face that seemed designed to escape notice. But as Miss Marple studied her carefully, she began to perceive something that others had missed. Beneath the nervous exterior lay a sharp intelligence, and in her eyes, when she thought no one was observing her carefully, there flickered something that might have been calculation. "Susan," Miss Marple said gently, "I understand you discovered Mr. Ashford this morning. That must have been a dreadful shock." "It was, ma'am," Susan replied quietly. "I've never seen anything like it." "And in the days preceding his death, did you happen to notice anything unusual about him? His behavior, his manner, his interactions with visitors?" Susan's eyes flickered upward for just an instant before returning to their downcast position. "I'm not sure I understand, ma'am. For instance," Miss Marple continued with relentless gentleness, "did you observe him meeting with anyone who seemed not to be a casual visitor? Anyone with whom he appeared to conduct business of a serious nature?" "There was a gentleman who called," Susan said slowly, "about a week ago. Not the one who came to the garden party, but a different one. He and Mr. Ashford had words. I heard raised voices from the study." "And did this gentleman happen to leave behind any object? Something small, perhaps? Something that he might later have asked you to return to Mr. Ashford's room?" Susan went very pale. Her hands began to tremble, and Miss Marple realized with sudden clarity that she had, in fact, identified the second actor in this dark drama. Susan Hartley's confession, when it came, emerged in fragments between sobs and moments of apparent dissociation, as though the girl herself could scarcely comprehend the sequence of events that had led her to become entangled in a crime of murder. It was Margaret who, having grasped the essential nature of what was occurring, insisted on telephoning Inspector Rutherford immediately. Within 20 minutes, the inspector and Constable Bridges had arrived at Thornfield House, and Susan was taken into formal custody, pending a more complete interrogation. Miss Marple remained at Margaret's insistence, and it was she who provided the framework within which Susan's fragmentary admissions could be assembled into coherent meaning. The gentleman who had called a week prior to David's death was a man named Arthur Felton, a London creditor to whom David owed a considerable sum, considerably more than the amount William Crestwell had mentioned. Felton represented not merely his own financial interests, but those of several other parties who had become deeply involved in David's various schemes. Felton had come to Thornfield House with what amounted to an ultimatum. David must repay the debt within 7 days, or Felton himself would take steps to ensure that David's various illegal activities were reported to the authorities. This was not merely a financial threat, but a legal one, and it had prompted David to what could only be described as a state of desperation. In the course of this conversation, Felton had discussed with David the various methods by which debts could be collected when conventional means proved insufficient. He had mentioned, almost in passing, that strychnine was a remarkably efficient substance for solving certain intractable problems. It had been, he suggested, used in various situations to encourage debtors toward cooperativeness or to arrange for their permanent removal from the equation. Susan, who had been cleaning the study at the time, had overheard this conversation. More significantly, she had observed the small, ornate tin box that Felton had removed from his pocket and placed on the desk as a form of visual emphasis to his threats. It was, he had explained, a sample, evidence that he possessed the means to accomplish what he had threatened. After Felton's departure, Susan had found herself possessed of an unusual combination of opportunity and knowledge. She had, on several subsequent occasions, encountered Patricia Stone in the village and had become aware, through the efficient gossip networks of small communities, that Patricia harbored intense feelings for David and had recently acquired chemical compounds. On the afternoon of the garden party, Patricia had pulled her aside and, in a state of obvious emotional distress, had confessed her intention to poison David sufficiently to make him ill, to punish him for his infidelity. It was at this precise moment that Susan had recognized an opportunity to accomplish something she had, in fact, been contemplating for some time. She had, years prior, been involved with a young man who had been ruined financially and socially by David Ashford's involvement in one of his schemes. That young man had ultimately taken his own life. Susan had never forgotten this, and the knowledge that David had caused such suffering without apparent remorse had festered within her for years. When Patricia had revealed her plan, Susan had seen not merely a pathway to murder, but a pathway to murder with a convenient scapegoat. She had deliberately encouraged Patricia's scheme, had even provided minor assistance in acquiring the strychnine, and had ensured that Patricia understood the lethal dosage required, all the while presenting herself as a sympathetic confidant. On the day of the garden party itself, Susan had taken the tin box that Felton had left behind. A box that David, in his preoccupation with his various troubles, had never bothered to reclaim. She had filled it with a small quantity of strychnine powder and had deliberately placed it in David's desk drawer during the afternoon, aware that it would eventually be discovered and would suggest either that David had been contemplating suicide or that he had possessed the poison for some other sinister purpose. By doing so, she had ensured that even if Patricia's role in the poisoning was discovered, the presence of the tin box would create confusion and uncertainty. It would suggest that there were multiple actors involved, that David's death was the result of some complex scheme rather than a simple act of emotional desperation. Inspector Rutherford, as he listened to this elaborate confession, looked at Miss Marple with an expression compounded of admiration and something approaching despair. "How did you know?" he asked. "How could you possibly have deduced all of this from the fragmentary evidence available?" "I didn't know," Miss Marple replied calmly. "I observed. I noticed that Susan had been positioned to hear David's private conversations. I observed the way she looked at him when she thought no one was watching, not with the usual deference of a servant, but with the intensity of someone harboring a long-standing grievance. And most importantly, I recognized that the tin box was not merely evidence of the crime, but a deliberate complication placed there by someone who stood to benefit from confusion and misdirection. "But Patricia Stone," the inspector began. "Patricia Stone is guilty of attempted murder," Miss Marple said, her voice carrying a note of sadness. "She is guilty of malice aforethought, of introducing a poison with lethal intent. That she miscalculated the dosage does not mitigate her culpability. However, Susan Hartley is guilty of something far more calculated and far more sinister. She has manipulated a vulnerable young woman into committing murder on her behalf, thereby accomplishing her own objective while ensuring that suspicion would fall on another." The courtroom proceedings that followed occupied the village's attention for several weeks, and the subsequent trials of both Susan Hartley and Patricia Stone became the subject of exhaustive speculation and analysis throughout St. Mary Mead. The legal system, in its deliberate and procedural manner, grappled with questions of culpability, intent, and the precise gradations of guilt that separated premeditation from desperation. Patricia Stone, represented by a competent solicitor who mounted a defense based on emotional disturbance and the RD influence of a more manipulative conspirator, received a sentence of 12 years imprisonment. The judge, while acknowledging the severity of her crime, noted that she had acted under psychological duress and with significant misunderstanding of the lethal consequences of her actions. She was, the court determined, a tragic figure rather than a calculating murderer, a young woman whose emotional vulnerability had been deliberately exploited by someone far more coldly rational. Susan Hartley, by contrast, was convicted of murder with malice aforethought. The evidence of her long-standing resentment, her careful manipulation of Patricia Stone, and her deliberate placement of the tin box to create confusion regarding David Ashford's death painted a portrait of calculated vengeance executed with meticulous precision. She received a sentence of life imprisonment, and her case became something of a legal precedent regarding the culpability of those who orchestrate crimes through the agency of others. William Crestwell left St. Mary Mead within a fortnight of the trial's conclusion, his business interests apparently having been resolved through means that remained deliberately obscure. Before his departure, he called on Miss Marple and expressed his gratitude for her intervention, which had absolved him of suspicion and allowed him to return to London with his reputation, if not entirely unblemished, at least not permanently stained by association with murder. "I confess," he said as he prepared to take his leave, "that I am astounded by the precision of your deductions. You perceived in a moment what the official investigation took days to establish." "Not perception," Miss Marple corrected gently. "Observation combined with a rather extensive knowledge of human nature. You see, Mr. Crestwell, I have lived in this village for a very long time. I have watched generations of people navigate the complexities of their emotional and financial lives. I have observed how resentment festers, how opportunity presents itself to those who are watching for it, and how the seemingly innocent often harbor the most elaborate schemes. Margaret Ashford, upon inheriting her nephew's modest estate, directed a significant portion of the proceeds toward establishing a scholarship fund in the name of the young man whose life had been destroyed by David's financial machinations. It was, she said, the least she could do to make some form of restitution for the harm that her late husband's family had, however inadvertently, caused. Dr. Havers returned to his ordinary rounds, though he found himself considerably more alert to the possibility that poison might be involved in cases that presented with certain ambiguous symptoms. Eleanor Hartwell wrote a detailed account of the case for circulation among her former colleagues in the educational world, presenting it as a cautionary tale regarding the dangers of overlooking the silent suffering that sometimes underlies, apparently, ordinary lives. It was on a cold December afternoon, some 6 weeks after Susan Hartley's conviction, that Miss Marple found herself once again seated beneath the oak tree at Thornfield House, though now as a guest of Margaret Ashford rather than as an observer of a garden party. The two women sat with tea and cakes, and the conversation turned, as conversations in small villages inevitably do, toward reflection on the extraordinary events that had disrupted the ordinary rhythms of their community. "I've been thinking," Margaret said slowly, "about what you said regarding human nature, about how the seemingly innocent often harbor the most elaborate schemes. Do you truly believe that people are capable of such complexity, such deliberate deception?" "I believe," Miss Marple replied, selecting a cake with deliberate care, "that every human being contains multitudes. We are never entirely what we appear to be on the surface. Susan Hartley, for instance, presented herself as a simple, nervous girl whose primary concern was the execution of her domestic duties. And yet beneath that modest exterior lay a woman capable of nursing a grievance for years, of recognizing opportunity when it presented itself, and of executing a plan of remarkable sophistication." "It's rather horrifying," Margaret said quietly. "It is," Miss Marple agreed. "But it is also, in a peculiar way, entirely natural. Humans are creatures of passion and appetite, of resentment and desire. We harbor injuries, real or imagined, and we carry them with us as surely as we carry our own skin. The question is not whether such impulses exist, but rather what we choose to do with them when they arise. Margaret was silent for a long moment, her fingers absently tracing the rim of her teacup. "Do you think Patricia Stone will be rehabilitated? Will she ever have a normal life?" "That," Miss Marple said, "depends entirely on Patricia. Prison will alter her, certainly, but whether that alteration will be toward growth and understanding or toward bitterness and calcification remains to be determined. The capacity for change exists in most people, but change requires a willingness to confront one's own complicity in the circumstances that have produced one's suffering." As the afternoon light began to fade and the temperature dropped with the approaching winter, Miss Marple prepared to take her leave. Margaret walked her to the gate, and as they stood there in the gathering dusk, both women were acutely aware that something fundamental had shifted in their village. The comfortable illusion of safety and predictability that small communities often maintained had been shattered, replaced by a more complex understanding that evil, genuine, premeditated evil, could flourish anywhere, given sufficient motive and opportunity. "Thank you," Margaret said simply, "for solving this, for bringing truth to light." "I merely observed," Miss Marple replied. "The truth was always there, waiting to be recognized by someone willing to look carefully enough. People are remarkably transparent when one takes the time to watch them." She walked back through the village streets as darkness fell, her small figure almost invisible against the winter evening. Behind her, Thornfield House stood silhouetted against the last remnants of daylight, and within its walls, Margaret Ashford sat alone in the drawing-room, contemplating the various ways in which the past could reach forward and disrupt the present. The tin box, that small ornate container that had held poison and served as the instrument of complicated vengeance, had been entered into evidence and was now locked away in some police storage facility, a monument to the capacity of seemingly insignificant objects to trigger profound consequences. Miss Marple, settling into her cottage for the evening, reflected on a principle that had governed her investigations for many decades. The most important mysteries were never the ones that puzzled the police or captured the headlines. They were, rather, the quiet mysteries of human motivation, the small betrayals and resentments that festered beneath the surface of ordinary village life. Understanding these mysteries required not superior intellect, but rather a willingness to recognize in others the same capacity for contradiction, for weakness, and for desperate action that existed within oneself. She picked up her knitting as the winter night settled around her cottage, the needles clicking softly in the silence. Tomorrow, the village would continue as it always had. Gossip would circulate, life would proceed, and gradually the extraordinary events of the past weeks would settle into the accepted narrative of village history, told and retold until they became part of the collective mythology of St. Mary Mead. But Miss Marple would remember. She would remember the expression in Susan Hartley's eyes when her elaborate scheme had been dismantled, the moment of recognition that her careful plans had been perceived and understood by someone patient enough to observe. She would remember Patricia Stone's tears and the tragic nature of a young woman's desperation, manipulated by someone far more calculating than herself. And in remembering, she would continue to understand that the greatest mysteries were not the ones that baffled the authorities, but rather the ones hidden in the ordinary hearts of ordinary people. The tin boxes we all carry within ourselves, containing the poisons of resentment, the toxins of betrayal, waiting only for the moment when they might be emptied into the lives of those who have injured us. The case of David Ashford's death would eventually close, filed away in official archives, its legal conclusions settled and its social implications absorbed into the village's collective consciousness. But for Miss Marple, sitting quietly with her knitting in the winter darkness, the case represented something far more profound, a confirmation of a truth she had long understood. that the human heart, for all its capacity for kindness and love, remained ultimately and eternally capable of extraordinary darkness.